Great. So, yeah, thank you all for joining. And this is part of the musings on cosmology of light. And in particular, today we're going to focus on the photons and mystery of photons, as I've called it. And there were a few blog posts that I've written that were suggested reading material. But before we kind of plunge into it, if we can just go around and everybody briefly introduce themselves, a little bit about their background and their interest in light, that would be great.
I'm Margaret Faines. So my two interests have been Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga and using graphics and digital art as a way to create meditative states. So I come at light from the inner experience of light energy, but then how it manifests. So I'm always trying to understand that connection of the inner experience and how to portray that. So Pravir has a cross section of exploring the quality. I would guess say it this way, Pravir, some of the qualities of light, and so that's my connection in.
Yeah, and I'll just say as well that Margaret and I are collaborating on creation of a book right now, which is Musings on Light. So that takes the blog post that I've written, and Margaret's a very gifted artist, and so she's rendering those writings into graphical illustrations. So
it takes the good news is imagination helps, right? Because even if I don't have a complete cognitive take, I can sort of make some creative leaps that can be useful in the translation. Cross fingers.
My name is Jim, and currently retired, but spent most of my professional life in the hardware and software industry, mostly in the quality assurance side of things. And currently, I spent a lot of my time on photography, particularly landscape and macro photography, trying to find different ways of portraying things so that they're sort of a less than obvious perspective, suggesting something beyond the actual realism that you're looking at. And as far as Pravir's work, since first following it, found it of great interest because I've had a long time informal interest in physics and science, and always interested in trying to get a better understanding of the universe and from those points of view.
thank you.
Yeah, I'm Roger Anderson. I've been interested in physics for a long time, and I've been studying all the stuff around Einstein. I don't just stick to the stuff they have told people in the mainstream. I sort of like look in deeper detail about things, and I sort of write things about that, and I put videos on YouTube about that. And so I think physics has gone sort of a bit in the wrong direction. So sort of like alternative physics rather than mainstream physics. But there's various other people interested in this alternative physics as well.
Yeah.
So I talk with them about these things.
Yeah, and I found that very interesting. And I think that's probably how we intersected, was because of both of our interest in alternative physics, if you will, because it's when I had studied whatever I could get my hands on from about a century ago, from Einstein and the other quantum physicists, many of them who received Nobel Prizes, one after the other. And I've been kind of struck by the lack of what to me has been like a lack of depth or a lack of continuation in the thought that existed back then. And so the light or cosmology of light for me has been a I wouldn't call it purely a scientific approach, but it's been an approach that has a bit of science in it, but also intuition, and then the kind of influence that I've had from reading some very profound books, for example, by Sri Aurobindo and others. And that's greatly influenced how I perceive things. And that's what I've tried to translate into these cosmology of light books and so on. But one day I just had the thought that, okay, what if light could travel at different speeds? And what if its native state was where it traveled infinitely fast? And so that began for me it was the beginning of a whole bunch of different thoughts. And that's what led to the creation of the 10 books on a cosmology of light. And then at some point, I don't have a mathematical background. Of course, I did computer engineering and computer science many decades ago, but I didn't have a training in mathematics. But I would say probably around 7, 8 years ago, I had a chance meeting with a mathematician in Berkeley, and he actually invited me for a meeting after having read some of my blog posts. And he was very mysterious about it, and he said that I want to share something with you, and I think you'd really appreciate it. And so we sat down at this restaurant in Berkeley, and there was like a candlelight on the table, and it was the table itself had a huge paper cloth. It was paper, and he took out a pencil and he started to write all these formulas during the course of dinner. And he said, "I want to share with you what I think of how the universe was created." And he went into a very personal uh, interpretation of things like E and pi and so on. And I just listened the whole evening and I didn't say anything. And then the next morning when I woke up, something in me had radically shifted. So there was some kind of initiation or something that happened. I suddenly got really interested in trying to express whatever I knew in mathematical terms. And so that was kind of the start of my beginning to write stuff mathematically, but it was not something I planned for, but it just happened very spontaneously, and I've just been following that stream for the last 7, 8 years. So.
That's quite a meeting when someone can somehow translate to you something that you may not even be aware of in the moment, but it starts a process.
Yeah. And there was, obviously I had been struggling with a lot of ideas at the time and trying to make sense of them. And so that was like a really nice way for me to begin to see things differently and articulate them differently. And then with the subsequent blog posts, I just tried to remove all the math from it. So the 50 posts that I wrote that has led to the Cosmology of Light musings were kind of, if you will, kind of kernels from the mathematical books, but without the math. And again, when I say mathematical, it's, if you go to any mainstream mathematician, they'd probably, they'd probably turn in their grave, right? So it's because they would be shocked by the kinds of things I call math. But anyway.
I was wondering if either one of you saved the table covering from that restaurant.
No, he actually wanted to remain anonymous.
Oh, okay.
Really interestingly.
That's perfect. That's the perfect end to that story. Mr. Anonymous.
Yeah.
That's like you dreamed it up.
You left the restaurant and he walked off towards the lamplight in the distance.
Pretty much.
That's good.
Yeah. Anyway, so let me just share the screen on the photons, and then I'd be interested to hear first. You can, let's see, hopefully you see the screen.
Yes.
There were 3 recommended readings. And we can start wherever you'd like to, if there was any thoughts or if there was comments or if you wanted to have a deeper discussion, if you have a different point of view, whatever, it's all open game. So we can take this anywhere you'd like. So what were some reactions if you read this? If you haven't, then I can go over some of the primary concepts.
Yeah, do that.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, let me do that. Yeah. So basically, as I was saying earlier, in this framework of cosmology of light, light has in its native state an infinite speed, and because it has an infinite speed, if we were to do a little thought experiment and consider a volume of any size, and you had light at the center, then because it had infinite speed, it would be present everywhere in that volume instantaneously. So it would have a quality of what we can call omnipresence or just a vast presence. Similarly, since everything exists in that fabric of light instantaneously, if anything were to appear or disappear, it would be recorded in the substance of light, and therefore light would have a property of some kind of omniscience on knowing whatever is happening in its vast field instantaneously. So that's the omniscience or the knowledge aspect. If anything not of the nature of light were to arise, since light was prevalent everywhere instantaneously, it would sooner or later overpower or subsume or integrate that thing into its nature, and therefore it would have a property of omnipotence or great power. And since everything is connected in the fabric of light, there would be a harmony that would exist, and an implicit harmony, because everything is happening in that one substance. And so therefore, when I think about light existing infinitely fast, the kind of reality that I can conceive is that of omniscience, omnipotence, omniharmony, and omnipresence, basically. And so that becomes the foundational state. But then that state also implies that there's infinite information in that state. And so light can supposedly project itself at different speeds. And so that gives rise to a cosmology of light, because if you have, assume you have light projecting itself at zero speed, therefore light can't travel anywhere. So it becomes the exact opposite of what we see when light's traveling infinitely fast. So instead of omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, omniharmony, it's the opposite qualities of that. So that's what when we look at this original photon, everything is an action of light. And so this kind of projection where light from being infinitely fast projects itself at zero speed, it in a sense creates like this big packet or envelope or context. And in this blog post, what I'm proposing is that's the original photon, in which kind of the bounds of existence are created, because you've got light traveling infinitely fast, you've got light at zero speed, and there's a whole context where you have all this tremendous power and knowledge and so on, and you have the exact opposite end of it, and that creates the playground for anything that were to arise within it. So that's the bounding context. And then if you have light projecting itself at speed c, which is the measured, at least scientifically, that's what's supposed to be the known constant speed of light, then we could argue that it gives rise to a certain experience of time and matter, time being past, present, future, and matter. So it creates, in a sense, how reality is experienced and how it emerges. And then we can extrapolate various other speeds, what kind of realities would exist. And so when you look at that totality and consider light existing at different speeds, you have these multiple layers of reality that all coexist within this kind of contextual frame, if you will, where you've got light traveling infinitely fast and light being projected at zero, and these different things exist within it, but they all influence each other hypothetically. But where we are in this physical universe where light travels at speed c, there's in a sense, an arbitration of these different influences that influence how physical life emerges and develops. And so that's the idea with kind of the cosmology of light, and with the idea of an original photon. So again, the original photon being this kind of envelope that's created within which everything else plays out. Let me pause there. So thoughts, comments?
Yeah, what I was thinking of when you were describing that, especially with light at sea, and say as us as observers within that overall environment, or I was thinking in one sense of light being able to sort of step in and out of the flow of light, and we've stepped in at sea, so to speak, and yet we're both in and objective to that environment simultaneously. So that just gives pause to considering, well, what is the appropriate perspective there, or are there multiple perspectives?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And one of the things that in a cosmology of light, even though light can travel at different speeds, but the nature of light is one. It's the same thing. And so, and light exists ubiquitously in a sense, even from a scientific point of view. We know that every atom has a deep signature of light within it because it's forged in the light of the suns or the math of supernova.
Mm-hmm.
We know that the most prevalent of quantum particles is a photon. I think it's upward of 98% or so, or maybe 99% of all quantum particles are actually photons. And that we know is a carrier of all information. So it's fair to say that when we interrelate with everything around us, we're actually in a massive light-based operating system, and we're connected to that due to the action of photons, which constantly stream a large amount of information into us and help us kind of ground ourselves in this light-based operating system. So, in a sense, without light, nothing would be. But the point is that light's so prevalent that we can hypothetically and even practically, I believe, just connect with it very intimately. And if you were to connect with it, then entering into the nature of light, which is one, regardless of how it projects itself, we would, to the point you were suggesting or making, is that you could experience a multiplicity of perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's not necessary that you're bound by something that you just experience because of the way your instrumentation has tended to develop when light travels at speed c. If you can, in a sense, bypass that. And I think my own point of view is that a tremendous way to bypass this incredible bias that exists around us when we perceive things is to actually imagine light. If we imagine light, I would say that connects us with the nature of light, and it's like a muscle that needs to be built. But the more we can see light in a different way than from our physical eyes, so with our mind's eye, if we kind of perceive light, or if we imagine light, I would propose that we're actually connecting with light. And when we connect with light, if we go deeply enough into it, we can change our point of view.
Yeah, I was thinking that as you were saying that, it's how do we develop a navigational apparatus, so to speak, that will allow us to move within that environment of infinite light.
Yeah.
So Pravir, when you are mentioning to see it with the mind's eye instead of with the physical eye, what struck me as you were talking is that so much of my viewpoint has to do with how I have focused on physical objects, right? It becomes a mindset. And I was thinking about the word, because it seems like when you're talking that what there are constants, you mentioned a couple, but things are much more plastic or much more in transition or you know, I mentioned something about one of the teachers of integral yoga, but the mother, Mira Alhasa, she talks about things being this and that. And Sri Aurobindo often talks about, you know, multifaceted and not just one point of view. And I just have this feeling that there's an intuition here that I haven't quite got, but there's something about the plasticity of light that has the potential to include what I think of as matter, but not be limited in that way. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. You know, the plasticity of light that can include matter but not be limited by it. I would tend to I tend to believe or see the same kind of thing as you expressed there.
You know, that as Margaret was speaking, I was recalling an experience that I had. I alluded to my interest in photography and trying to use that as a vehicle for seeing the environment more multidimensionally than the 3D space, so to speak. And I recall meeting with this photographer some years ago. His name is John Wimberly. And he's in a sense, a traditional landscape photographer, pure black and white aesthetic. But as I was looking at his work and, you know, just what appeared to be these straightforward landscapes, but most of them had a different quality in it, like sort of a mysterious light element in them. And as I was talking with him, I said, well, what is this? And his simple answer was, well, I really don't know. He said, because when I go out into the field and I'm just sort of waiting for that moment, you know, I kind of sense a scene unfolding in front of me. And he said, in a lot of these, we're not in the viewfinder of the camera. He said, these facets that you see in the photographs emerged in the dark room, you know, and what he was trying to say, I think, was he saw something or sensed something that even the camera wasn't picking up, nor was his physical eye.
Yeah.
But then the ultimate print of the landscape revealed this extra dimension. And you could say, well, that's an accident, or the light struck something a certain way and produced this unusual effect. But it was kind of remarkable.
It was a different quality. You're talking about
Yeah.
a different, there was a different quality.
I see.
And so,
Yeah.
you know, that's another.
He
you know, that
mentioned
comes
it,
to mind.
he even used the word, he said, there's something about an ally, you know, like almost a being
Wow.
or something that was coming through that, you know, and he was reluctant to say this. Right?
Another facet of this that, you know, the kind of a more personal perspective that was interesting is this. When we met him, it was an artist open house event. And he was using his living room in his home as his gallery space for this. And when we arrived there, there was no other visitors yet. And we were talking with him for quite a while. And then probably for 45 minutes or so. And then his wife came in. She was out on an errand. And after greetings in a few moments, she kind of took me aside and she said, this is very unusual. She says, John's a very quiet, introspective person. I've never seen him so animated.
Wow.
And I think it was because we sort of drew him out to explain that. And he, you know, just opened up fully. So it was interesting.
And what did you say his name was? John what?
Wimberly, Wimberley, I think.
Great. Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating. Roger, let me um, kind of ask what your thoughts or what impressions you have or inputs.
Well, I think in terms of
I mean, just whatever. I mean, whatever the
yeah,
conversation so far, or any other thoughts, or
yeah, I think in terms of accelerating, and you're accelerating to the speed of light, what happens? Sort of Einstein thought of it in terms of what happens if you're traveling at the speed of light and you're looking in a mirror in front of you. What happens to the light then? And I think he concluded from that you can't go at the speed of light. So, so it's all like something prevents you from going at the speed of light. But I'm not sure if I believe that. But there's other things these people talk about it, and when they've done the Star Trek film, Star Trek the motion picture, they recreated, supposed to have recreated what it would be like if you were traveling at the really fast speed, what would happen as you accelerate. And they say in the Star Trek TV series, they didn't show that part of the space travel. So they were traveling at the speed of light and they suddenly had a problem with an asteroid in front of them and they had to blow up an asteroid and things. So they did that in the Star Trek motion film. But when you think about it, as your spaceship or whatever where you're going in and it's accelerating, all the light in front of you is getting to you, but the light behind you is not reaching you. So behind you it starts getting blacker and blacker and you can't see anything, and the only light is that in front of you. And so you've got kind of like you're going in a tunnel, and so there's only the light in front of you which you can see. And sort of like some people compare that as the tunnel which you go through when you're dying, because people have reported there's a light in front of them and they're going into a tunnel. And so maybe that when you're dying, you're starting to go at the speed of light.
That's very interesting.
But I haven't really looked into it in too much detail.
Yeah,
It's interesting what you were just saying, because we were having a conversation with friends recently, and that subject came up in a way, and the whole point of the transition of death from life to death, and not only does the physical body change, but the consciousness as well.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting, as you were just saying, to think of it from that perspective, that, well, what's happening in the body, in the consciousness, as you transition in this state?
The body, it's material matter, and your consciousness has been released, and you're sort of like accelerating up to light speed.
You better
So it
watch
might be
out, Roger. You're getting into the mystical territory there.
so it might all just be physics.
Might all just be physics. Yeah.
But we don't know.
Okay. Well, that's not a negative.
Yeah.
So I've read in a couple of places, Roger, and I can. There was somebody, I think, from maybe Georgia Institute of Technology who's been researching light, and I don't remember the exact reference, but the point being made was that even if you think about the theory of relativity, it doesn't preclude anything that's traveling faster than light already. The only problem is approaching the speed of light. What's your thought on that?
Well, my thoughts are that Einstein's been misunderstood. So,
Okay.
and it was probably his wife who wrote the paper. So he wasn't really understanding it properly. So when they talk about the speed of light and that, it's sort of like, I don't think it should be interpreted the way it's being interpreted. But it's sort of like the way it is interpreted is the speed of light is a limit to material objects. So you've got to be a non-material object to travel at light speed. But then if you're going faster than light speed, the equations start getting strange because you sort of bringing in imaginary numbers, which is the square root of -1. this stuff.
Yeah.
So I think it's a bit of a maths fiddle, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Right. Okay. Let me just reshare the screen here. So I'm not sure if you may have looked at the other cosmic sized photons, and we can go there, or even this directory of photons. Does anybody have a preference where we focus on next?
No, just
Okay.
what feels right to you.
All right. Okay. This is a short bridge. So let's go to the other cosmic sized photons. And so in the original photon, as I was suggesting, you've got the opposite of the omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, omniharmony, which you can think of as darkness, weakness, ignorance, chaos. And it's a quadrality, so it's still symmetrical with those properties of light, except it's the apparent absence of them. So that becomes the original photon. But then if we think about other photons, and here, we're suggesting a photon is any packet of light, but the packet of light doesn't necessarily have to be like a micro quantity. It can be a macro quantity as well. And that's how these other quote unquote photons appear when in this kind of in this series of writings. But the other here, um, we also talked about the other photon as being the one that creates information to actually create the physical universe as we experience when light is traveling at a constant speed of c. And so that's, in a sense, the second or the other cosmic sized photon. And if we go back to, I want to go to directory of photons because that has perhaps some pretty controversial or a more complete list of what I would consider to be photons. And let's see. Yeah, okay. So in this point of view, all of these different emergences, and we can go into this a little more depth, things like space-time, energy, gravity, things that we understand as the electromagnetic spectrum, which here I've broken up into a quadrality, which I call electromagnetic wave archetype mass potential spectrum. So it's a quadrality that has those 4 parts into it. And then the quark-lepton boson, Higgs boson is again another quadrality that I can map back to the 4 properties of light. And then you've got within the boson category, again, a quadrality, gluon, W and Z boson, photon, and graviton. And then at the atomic or periodic table level, where you've got atoms that are classified in a quadrality as well, S shell, P shell, D shell, F shell. And then when you get to the level of any living cell, the molecular plans are split also into quadrality, nucleic acid, polysaccharide, lipid, and protein. And these all, I can make the case that each of these has a one-to-one mapping with the property of either knowledge, presence, power, or harmony, and therefore they are a materialization of light, a progressive materialization of light. But not only that, even if we consider the human instrument, then thought, will, emotion, sensation is also a quadrality. And so, for example, like thought equating to knowledge, will to the power aspect, emotion to the harmony aspect, and sensation to the presence aspect. And then similarly, we can equate cultures to knowledge, presence, power, presence, harmony, cultures with different countries having a particular genius where there's some unique combination of whatever is meant by knowledge, power, presence, and harmony. So if we think of knowledge, presence, power, and harmony as large independent sets where knowledge has up to infinite elements related to knowledge, different variations of knowledge, then you can foresee that that could be the basis of creating unique seeds. If you uniquely combined different elements from these different sets in a particular way, then you would have the basis for any kind of unique culture or a unique country or a unique individual. And so this thinking applies from this point of view. We are therefore also a materialization of that vast potentiality that exists in light. So we can see the progressive materialization as it goes through these different levels. And space-time energy gravity has, to me, has two aspects. There's a macro aspect and there's a micro aspect. So I make the proposal that, in fact, space-time energy gravity is something that comes into being when light projects itself at C. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this in a minute. When it projects itself at C, then there's a macro container that's created that has these properties of space-time energy gravity, but space is very specifically all these diverse seeds of knowledge. So there's a granularity to space. And so space becomes the playing field within which all the infinite knowledge can play out independently, in a sense. And time becomes the equivalence of power, because it's inevitable that what's contained in the seed is going to mature. But the rate of maturation is time, is measured by time. And then when seeds materialize, there's usually a relationship between seeds and seeds, or a seed and seed. And that, to me, is what gravity is in its deeper sense. And energy, so therefore it's an aspect of harmony. And if we think about energy, it's that process by which something that exists in seed form becomes material. So there's a materialization of energy, or there's different shifts in energy, or energy remains what it is, but it shows itself in different forms until it condenses into matter. So in a sense, space-time energy gravity is nothing other than knowledge, power, presence, and harmony.
Mhm.
And that creates both the macro container within which we exist, but also, importantly, I relate this to genetics, because at the micro level, the script in which any genetic type information is written, I would say, is space-time energy gravity in the smallest way. So if we want to change anything genetically, we in fact have to penetrate and change its space-time energy gravity properties, or what space-time energy gravity means for that thing in order to effectively mutate it. So if we do that, then that's kind of the basis of genetics. And I've written a lot about this as well. But again, stepping back, all of these are, in a sense, photons, because they are all a specific kind of phase of light, or a specific packet of light that is going to impact how materialization occurs. And so, while there's a school of thought that would say that every photon is the same, I would in fact argue that every photon is unique, because a photon is, in a sense, a bridge mechanism between some deeper information and the information that's going to materialize. And so every photon carries within it, even though we don't know how to read it at the moment, that specification for how something should materialize uniquely, in this kind of realm. Anyway, let me pause there. So
One thing that struck me about this is in reference to what we were talking about a little earlier about navigational tools. And it strikes me that what you've done here, this, let's say, distillation of these different quadralities, in a way, it's like these are different signposts that we can navigate, as from a human consciousness point of view, and using them maybe in connection with each other or in opposition to each other to find ways to navigate the different nodes within the overall universe
Mhm.
of our experience. And so,
Yeah.
when you do look at our physical world, well, there are many perspectives one could take, and some are connected more intimately or directly with others, whereas others seem to be at opposite extremes of a spectrum, perhaps. So anyhow, that just struck me as, well, there is, it's almost like you're providing a map, of these different signposts on the map.
Yeah,
How can we best move about on that?
yeah, that's a really nice way of looking at it. I never thought about that, but thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
The other point that you mentioned about the seeds and the relationship of the seeds, and I was thinking about, say we can't read it yet.
Mhm.
And I mean, it's sort of simplistic, but the seed, we think of we have many examples of the potential, right? That
Mhm.
in a way, we can't read the seed either,
Mhm.
right? I mean, there's things in there that are going to evolve that we don't have. So I'm not sure what kind of information is either in light or behind light or a field behind, you know what I mean? I don't get that yet, but
Yeah.
you're trying to hint at there's maybe multi-dimensions in that seed.
Yes. So the seed is, I would say, a result of the multi-dimensional dynamics of light.
Okay.
So in a sense, there is if we go back to that, there is some kind of native state where light exists infinitely fast, and that conceivably has infinite information in a form we completely don't understand. So it's maybe very condensed. It's very integrated and so on. But then as it projects itself, so as light projects itself, I would say that light projects itself so that that infinite information can be quantized into diversity. So there's a deliberation there, and that infinite information, when light travels slower, then there's, in fact, that's the basis of trying to separate out that infinity into threshold packets of totality and yet uniqueness, that then become the basis for how things appear on that projected layer. And when you think about a seed, the seed is kind of the interrelationship. There's always a kernel or a unique line of kind of development that you can string back to that plane where it's infinitely fast, but you have four distinct properties. But those four properties, as it begins to quantize and diversify, become more and more explicit, and they show the totality of what was in it more explicitly. And that's always through progressive quantization at each slower speed. And at that point where light begins to travel at speed c, and that's where we've begun to record, obviously, since we exist here, um, our kind of conceptualization of quantization and packets and things. But inside each packet, there's uniqueness that comes from these different layers and how that diversification has taken place. And at some point before light projects itself at C, you've got that seed form in a subtle state, if you will, and then that projects itself or materializes into space. And space then is nothing else than a playground of these vast seeds that all need an arena in which to play themselves out. So space becomes this vast arena in which all this uniqueness that exists can be the basis for reaching maturity and collectivities and so on. So
Pravir, are you saying that as the light slows down, that more is revealed, at least from our point of view?
yes,
Okay.
yes, exactly. From so whatever was implicit becomes more explicit.
Okay.
And
So
along those lines, I was wondering, what is it that allows for an Einstein, for example, to have an insight or an intuition that allows him to, quote unquote, see things in a new way or break through to a new realm of
The
understanding?
revelation is,
Yeah.
yeah.
well, let me pass it on to Roger for his comments, and then I can.
Yeah. What always strikes me about this thing, you're talking about a united world, unified world. The mainstream physics really hasn't got the gravity part combined with the other forces of nature. They've got three forces of nature: the weak, strong, and the electromagnetic force, and they think they can explain that by the maths, but they've got problems bringing gravity into it.
Mhm.
So it always struck me that they're kind of glossing over that lots of the time.
Yeah. And I know, so Roger, would you have an opinion on whether it was Einstein or somebody else? Why would they have insight into what other physicists or scientists cannot see? What kind of allows them to see things differently?
Well, Einstein, he protested at the direction that physics was going in when he had a big argument with over quantum physics, and he said something like, "God does not play dice with the universe." So he didn't like the structure which they were building up from the quantum physics, where everything's just random, indeterminate, and uncertainty. He didn't like that structure which they were building upon, but they rejected what Einstein was saying, and they've built their physics upon this quantum physics. And it's sort of, they've only been able to combine the electromagnetic and the weak and the strong force together. And with Einstein, he built his structure of relativity, and it's not built on the same sort of understanding about things. And so when they, with theoretical physics, they start thinking about that, they then think, well, they've got to, usually the dogma seems to be that Einstein was wrong about quantum physics, but he was right about relativity. But taking that point of view, they can't combine the two things then. And if you start saying that Einstein was wrong about relativity, you get a load of people trying to defend him. Mm-hmm. And so there seems to be there's two structures built up in physics, and they can't get them combined. And there's sort of like too much personal issues involved in it. Mm-hmm. So you're looking at it two different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Thank you.
Yeah. That reminds me, thinking back on a documentary we saw about the process leading up to the Higgs boson discovery. And I remember one of the scientists that they interviewed, and they interviewed several, before the actual confirmation of what they had found. And this fellow was saying that, well, it could go this way or it could go that way. If it goes that way, and I don't remember exactly what his field of study was, he says, if it goes that way, then over 4 decades of my life has been for naught. And it reminds me of what you were just saying. You have these two opposing schools, and one's going off on one track and another on the other. And then if there's a discovery further out and it can only align maybe with one of them, then it's going to be a pretty desperate experience for those that were off on the other one. So
yeah. the sort of Professor Hawking was trying to find a way of combining quantum physics with relativity, and he came up with a lot of strange things like what they called Hawking radiation. So black holes in relativity are supposed to be black, and nothing escapes from them. But then he sort of like Hawking combined quantum physics to it, and he said, well, the vacuum is bubbling with particles, and they cancel out most of the time and leave nothing. But sometimes they don't cancel out, and one particle will fall into the black hole, and the particle can go the opposite direction. So you've got radiation coming out from the vacuum around the black holes, Hawking radiation, and then the experimental physicists and that said, well, we've got to try to find evidence for that, and so they're still trying to find evidence for it. So how do you combine relativity and quantum physics, and things kind of get strange?
I'll say.
Yeah, thanks. And Jim, if I were to also comment on the previous question you had posed, is why somebody like, whether it's Einstein or somebody else, is able to come up with a different point of view, then in a sense, in a cosmology of light framework, it would be because they tapped into the nature of light in a more intimate way, and that offered a different perspective in a sense. So whether it's
sort of what I was alluding to as far as looking at your different quadralities. And one might say, well, Einstein found a way to step from one into the other, kind of holding both simultaneously and making that transition to better understand the commonplace quadrality from a different perspective.
So I don't know if anybody has any closing thoughts, but we're at the top of the hour, so I'll.
Wow, that was fast.
But thank you. It was a very rich discussion, and a lot of great things to ponder on further. I'll probably post this on Facebook, and I'll just tag each of you, since you're each my friends.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Okay. And just there's a few people who listen to them. I think a handful. There's like 10 people who like to listen to it, so
It's wonderful.
it'll be for their benefit. Okay.
I just want to say thank you to Roger, because there's so many things you brought up or just added in that I wouldn't have known about, and outside of my area. So it was a nice counterpoint. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a very rich and stimulating discussion. I really enjoyed it.
One nice thing, Pravir, is that my experience is that over time, funny word, there is something about being presented your work over time, because if I'm shifting perspective, sometimes you'll go into a new perspective, but then go back, right? It's like having 2 points on the perspective, and when I hear this more often, it's like it opens a new groove, opens a new pathway, and then each time it seems like I'm more comfortable because I'm going back to something I have a context for. So I guess I want to don't despair that it takes people a while.
No, not at all. For me, this has been more like a passion, and it almost is irrelevant, how many people like it or not, or just
No,
something.
I get that, but just that understand that there may be a
Sure.
a different sense of opening up, and
Mhm.
over time that you'll find, oh, that person is actually coming back around again. Well, it's because of that. It's like putting your toe in, and then, okay, well, I don't know, and then maybe a little more, that has a, this in particular, I find it has that kind of immersion quality of where a transformation can happen, because it's just little by little. It might be a big wow, but more likely at the deeper levels, it's just kind of a
Progressive.
softening, and
Yeah.
it's like experiencing plasticity in yourself,
Mhm.
right? And at first it's like, woo, that's not the way that's not how I identify, or that's not how I, that roll. That's not how I roll. But yeah, it's exciting to see that. Don't worry about how fast it happens.